Hi everyone, welcome to our bi-weekly YouTube live stream. Today we are talking about using Google Tag Manager for accelerated mobile pages. I'm Krista Seiden, Analytics Advocate at Google, and today I'm joined by Ben Graham, who is a Product Manager on Google Tag Manager, and Martijn Scheebeller, who is the Director of Marketing at The Next Web. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Absolutely, thanks.
So let's go ahead and take a look at that agenda. We're going to talk about several things today. So first, we're going to start with what is AMP? What are accelerated mobile pages? I know that that might be new to some of you, so Ben's going to go ahead and walk us through what that really is. Then we're going to hear about using Google Tag Manager for accelerated mobile pages. Then we'll walk into some best practices and tips. Martijn will then take us through a case study of what using Google Tag Manager for accelerated mobile pages means for a publisher. And then we'll finish with a few other things that we're working on for Tag Manager and mobile apps before taking your questions. So just a reminder, you have that link on your screen for questions. Go ahead and submit your questions either via that form. It's linked in the description of this YouTube Live session as well, or you can always submit your questions through the YouTube Live chat box. So we'll be taking your questions at the end. So anything you want to know about AMP and GTM, definitely go ahead and ask us. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. And Ben, you can go ahead and tell us about AMP. What is AMP?
Great. AMP is a platform that Google put out about a year ago. And its focus is really on building just really great mobile experiences for the web. So whether you have a very, very slow connection or you got a fast connection, there are all sorts of things that it's aiming to improve just to drive that experience to as the best that it can be. So that's download times, that's also things like the page jumping around when you're scrolling through and reading an article, those sorts of kind of annoying things that get in our way. It's focused at really tackling some of those and improving the experience for everyone.
Awesome.
It's open source, which is really great. So that means plenty of people outside of Google are already contributing to this, and it's really, really neat to see. Kind of the initial numbers coming back are really encouraging. So we've seen pages that are loading 4 times faster rather, and sending down a lot less data to the devices that are actually browsing this, which is a huge win for whether you're worried about your bandwidth or it's back to that page speed.
Yeah, so it sounds like AMP pages in general are making that user experience on mobile just much, much better.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in Tag Manager, we absolutely love AMP. So this is something that we really want to start pushing out there and getting a lot more people using. And it's something that we're trying to take AMP and make it even easier to use when you're implementing measurement solutions on your pages. So some of the things that we're focused on are kind of the more difficult areas to get on board with AMP in terms of above and beyond the basic sort of tracking that's in place. We'll dive into the specifics of what some of this looks like. But outside of just doing a single page view metric for a single provider, it really starts to get kind of convoluted and complex in order to implement that on your AMP pages. So this is something that Tag Manager specifically is going after and really trying to make it much easier for everyone, as well as bringing all those Tag Manager features that people are used to, like previewing and deploying across different properties and sites.
So it sounds like there's a lot of benefit to be gained with AMP, but just on its own, it can be a little bit difficult or heavy to deploy.
On the measurement side of things, that's right. It's just different than what we're used to.
Gotcha.
So let's take a look at what that looks like. For just a generic Google Analytics installation to look at page views, this is the snippet that you drop on your page, on your AMP page. Mm-hmm. Looks a little bit different than what we're used to. We're used to seeing JavaScript and a bunch of code kind of thrown together. This looks very code-like and developer-friendly, but it's not what we're used to. AMP has dedicated a whole library inside of their platform to analytics, just for measurement. So the team and everybody involved knows that measurement's important, and they're trying to make that as flexible as possible. So they built things like flexible trigger support and the ability to kind of really build out those more complex scenarios within your measurement solution for your AMP pages. What I'd like to do is take a look at, this is a snippet for GA. Now, if you want to install Tag Manager on your AMP pages, this is the snippet that we have. So it's a single line that we drop on the page, basically in the same place, but this is what you'd put on every single one of your pages moving out.
So that's significantly different. In the last scenario, it was a large block of code that you would have to put on every page, and now it's one line of code to implement via Tag Manager.
Yeah, that's right. And this is using something that AMP has given us using remote config. So what this lets us do is Google Tag Manager can take care of that complexity of figuring out what that config file should look for you. That gobbledygook of JSON is what it is.
That's an official term, right? Gobbledygook?
Gobbledygook, yeah, absolutely. Look it up. So just a couple of notes about Tag Manager in AMP. It is dynamic configuration that you get in the other platforms. You'll have that on AMP as well. So if you need to make updates, you don't have to go redeploy to your entire site. But it does require a new container in Google Tag Manager. So if you're already using Tag Manager today for your websites, this would be a new additional container that you create specific for AMP because it functions so much differently.
Yeah, so that's an important thing to note about just implementing Tag Manager for AMP is that it is that new container. So there's a little bit of upfront cost in terms of development work and implementation, but the benefits sound like they're definitely worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it'd be helpful to take a look at what it looks like past a page view. So if we look at what analytics requires, we've taken that original snippet that we dumped on the page, and you can see it's almost twice as large just to track one more thing. So this would be tracking link clicks, anchor clicks on your web page and page views. And that's it. It required a whole new to know a different URL that you had to specify. You had to add this new trigger and understand what that meant and what all that configuration looks like and what it's for. And this is for just one different type of trigger. Each different type of trigger inside of AMP Analytics has a different configuration with different settings.
And it would make that code grow and grow and grow.
Absolutely, absolutely. One other note is if you decide to use more than just one provider, so if you're using AdWords conversion tracking or DoubleClick in addition to Google Analytics, you can double whatever you've got in here because you've actually got add a whole additional section that replicates this for each individual provider.
Right, and I'm sure Martijn especially can attest, as a publisher, you're using multiple platforms, right?
Definitely. If you start adding more context to your pages, these JSON snippets really get out of hand.
Yeah. So now we'll dive into what it looks like, how the snippet changes in Google Tag Manager. So that's for all of your different triggers. Now I'm being slightly silly here because you don't quite get that for free, but it does not change, and that's really what we're aiming for. So what it really comes down to is going into Google Tag Manager. We provide a user interface to be able to select which types of triggers you want to use that are available in AMP. And then we've got these are just a couple of examples of some of the built-in variables that we offer. So you don't have to necessarily go back each time and look at what that is and try to figure out where in that giant JSON file to put those values and how to piece all that puzzle together.
So everything that was in that last snippet, that really long one that only had that one additional event that you were tracking, that's all now contained within this one snippet. It's all there, and you're doing all those modifications through the GTM user interface.
That's right. That's right. And then in terms of like the deployment, we've shown the snippet is pretty small and easy, and you essentially just put that on every single one of your pages. In GTM, all you need to do is jump into GTM, create a new container for AMP, put the snippet on your page, and then go to town tagging within Google Tag Manager, preview your site, and then publish it, and you're ready to go.
Awesome. Yeah, pretty standard to how you would do any GTM implementation, but just with that new container for AMP.
Yeah, absolutely. That really focuses on those differences between what we're used to in the web, normal web, and what AMP provides. Yeah.
Awesome.
And a couple of things that I think are important to mention about AMP. Again, it's a different platform, and they've got rules and restrictions. One of the biggest things that we don't have available in AMP is JavaScript. We can't just go create whatever JavaScript we want, ask our developers to help us out and create new functionality and just drop that on the page. It's just not an option in AMP pages. So that provides limitations across the board when you're building your AMP pages or you're deploying your measurement solutions. And again, when it comes into how we're used to doing things, we're really used to JavaScript, right? We've gotten really good at it. It's not an option when you're dealing with AMP. So that's one thing to point out and one limitation. And then another thing here is, as things stand today, there are certain things variables that you may want to reference that are only available on the client. Now, oftentimes with Google Tag Manager, we don't really have to think about the client and the server because we manage all that for you. But there are plenty of times where you've set up a trigger, for instance, of when you want this to fire, and it's conditioned based on something happening in the client. That's not always available in Google Tag Manager. So we'll present that to folks and say, hey, you're not allowed to do that because we don't have that information available ahead of time.
Gotcha. Good to know.
Yeah. And then one other thing I think that's really important to think about before you actually get started and assume everything's hunky-dory is think about how you want to view these, the results and the measurement in Google Analytics or whatever platform you're looking at. You know, some people set up a different property, some people just set up different custom dimensions. There's all ways of, a whole slew of ways of slicing and dicing this information, but I think it's a good idea to think about that ahead of time so you can figure out how to isolate that AMP traffic, for instance.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call. Almost similar to what we say for any implementation in terms of thinking about your measurement plan and thinking about how that data is actually going to look in the analytics UI when you're trying to read and analyze it. I know Martijn was actually mentioning to me the other day that their AMP pages have a different URL than your regular pages. So they are going to come in looking differently, and you should think about ahead of time how you want to visualize that and separate that out in your analytics accounts.
Yeah, absolutely. And then diving in a little bit deeper, you know, I mentioned this kind of client and server, and there's some limitations. Not all hope is lost. You're still able to track things that are important to us. And I'll just quickly run through an example of a product page for something. I've chosen skis because I'm a huge snow skier. It's one of my passions in life. But what it looks like is you take that snippet that we put that is out there for Google Tag Manager, and that's the one that's the same on every page. And the way you customize that for individual pages so you can have your specific product information is by adding a little snippet that basically defines the variables that you care about. And the thing to note for our existing Tag Manager users is this is the equivalent or very close to what most people are familiar with as the data layer. So it's not quite a direct translation, but it's pretty darn close. So here you define what you want in this in your variables, and then from within GTM, you just create a new variable, and you choose AMP variable, and then you configure the name that you called it. So you can see here that I use ski.length, and this then means that I could pass ski.length and its value to any of the measurement providers that I'm using.
That's awesome. So very similar to how you would use Google Tag Manager and a data layer on a normal web page.
That's right.
You can get a lot of that individual information that you want to gather here from an AMP page.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the entire goal. And now I'd like to turn it over to Martijn. He's director of the Next Web, and he can dive into a little bit of specifically how a large publisher has really taken and started embracing AMP and then also used Google Tag Manager.
Absolutely. So one of the bigger things for us as a publisher is that we also like to provide more context to our web analytics. So if you look at an average article page, like this one, you really would like to know more about what you see there in your web analytics. Like we got the basic page view information, but like we talked about before, you want to provide more context. And like AMP is great in giving the users a better reader experience, but for us as a publisher, there are multiple ways to do that. And over the last year, a lot of other social platforms came out with their own solutions to do so. So for us, it was really hard to guess what the opportunity was for AMP specifically. But being at an open source project and having a lot of geeky developers in our company, it made it great that they could work on the open source project like together with the original founders of the project. And in the end, it really leads back to what AMP stands for, is really providing a better user experience, faster load times, but also easier interaction with the page. So I think about 11 months ago now, we started implementing AMP very low key, and we saw that the first results were like less than 1% of the page use. Because the adoption rate for platforms that are using AMP was very low at the time. But currently, due to some viral articles from time to time, we see that like the adoption rate of AMP is going up to 5 to 10% already. And like with more platforms going to support this, like Twitter, LinkedIn in the future, this will probably increase even more for us, which is a good thing. So recent additions for us in AMP have been adding related stories, increasing the engagement and increasing the opportunity for the user to view and click more articles. The great thing about AMP itself is that there is a very visible and open roadmap that will allow you to see what's going to happen. So things based out of that make us that like newsletter sign-up forms, which were just released a week ago, become available to us as a publisher to get more newsletter subscribers. So what really drove us to like using Google Tag Manager instead of like the classic analytics that Ben just talked about was really like an easier implementation. The JSON objects that you would need to use to provide more context with like all these custom variables is very interesting to do if you would like to stick with AMP Analytics and would like to track a lot of information. So like moving that data layer that you know from the web version, we try to port that over to the custom variables that we have available now in GTM for AMP. And really moving towards GTM for AMP made it possible for us to really save on the cost of implementation there, because making a lot of changes to a big JSON object with a lot of information for us as being a relatively big publisher, that's quite hard. But one of the great other integrations that Google Tag Manager has is like the visual tagging templates for our measurement partners, for example, but also like scroll tracking that we talked about before and that we're going to dive in a little bit deeper later. Because that provides us with more insights into the interaction of our users and to really get some sense and to really make sure that you can report on what they're doing on the page. And later on I will show you an example of that. So to highlight once more, like really the big things for us as a publisher are more integrations to make sure that we can track more interaction, but also more context about article pages for most. And because in the end, that really leads back to also the depth of our analytics integrations related to the metrics that we have as a publisher. Like measuring reach and measuring page views, of course, very simple. You can do that just with the basic integration of GTM for AMP. But measuring engagement and really trying to get some sense into what the user is clicking on a certain AMP page, but also where that leads to, in like, is the user becoming more loyal or what is he doing? That makes it really complicated if you would need to do that with classic AMP analytics. And Google Tag Manager for AMP makes it really easy because it's better and easier to organize like the things and the triggers that you would like to use for tracking certain elements on the page. Let's say sharing buttons, related stories, or newsletter forms. And then the last one is of course increasing the user's retention and their loyalty, making sure that they come back more often to us as a publisher, like building our brand. So being able to follow them or leverage the information that we have about them for remarketing is great because GTM for AMP has these tag templates already available to do so. So how that really looks like from an implementation perspective for us is like we moved most of the data layer information and the custom variables that we had built in previously into classic AMP analytics and moved them over to the custom variables, how we know them these days in GTM for AMP. So we send data like author, the publish date to really get more context in our web analytics on what the page is about. So we know, like Krista mentioned before, like if you first know what you're going to report on, then it makes it also easier to change the integration and save more information about what a user is doing or what you can do with the context on an article page. We need to send the data to like measurement partners like Quantcast and Comscore, so that's what we use the visual tagging templates for. And in addition to that, we have more custom tracking in place for scroll tracking, just to make sure that we can measure like, okay, is a user reading 20% of the article? How long is that article? Or is he reading like the whole article? That's pretty significant impact if the user is reading 100% of a 200-word article versus a 3,000-word one. Or other tracking, like I said before, like sharing and related stories. So the current phase that we're in is we're trying to follow as much as we can about the current roadmap of AMP, trying to work closely with the GTM team on making sure that we can implement that as fast as possible. And hopefully then what you will see is the screenshot here is like one of the examples on what we try to get as much as possible, get our AMP pages on top of the related or the top stories in Google search results for high volume keywords like the Samsung 7 in this case. But knowing that that page that will rank for us and knowing in our web analytics what like the context is, that it's about Samsung, that the article was like published an hour ago, that's very important information for us to know in our web analytics setup. So this is one of the examples I wanted to highlight where GTM for AMP is really giving a lot of benefit over like the classic AMP analytics setup, because it allows you, by not using JavaScript but just using the features that are available in GTM, to measure scroll depth. And that's very important, like I said, for a publisher. We would like to know how far down the page a user is reading and how much of the article he is consuming. Yeah. So by using the custom funnel reporting in Google Analytics, we are able to, based on the GTM tracking, measure the impact it has on a certain page.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, Martijn. Actually, custom funnels are my very favorite report in Analytics 360.
They're the best.
But I think it's a really good use of custom funnels here because you're using events at every step. And that's something that you wouldn't be able to do with the traditional goal funnel. You'd have to set that up ahead of time. You couldn't use an event as the last goal step. So this is a great use of that and a great use of scroll tacking to really be able to see how a user progresses all the way down your page.
Absolutely.
So that's awesome. I want to go ahead and switch gears just a little bit because we've actually launched several other new things in Google Tag Manager for mobile apps recently. And Ben, I wanted to give you a chance to just kind of update our users on what's new there.
Great, thank you. Just quickly touch on what we did back in May. At Google I/O, we launched a new version of our SDK, and this is for mobile apps. So where AMP is focused on mobile web browsing experience, these are for app developers. And what we did there is we took Google Tag Manager and started embracing Firebase, so we could leverage all of the power that Firebase provides when you integrate on their SDK. One of the big things there is when you want to trigger things, for instance, in Google Tag Manager to go out to whatever measurement provider you're using, like Google Analytics. Firebase Analytics actually has automatically detected events, and these events, as soon as you install Firebase, the Firebase SDK, they're available. You'll start seeing your Firebase data populate, and it's just there. It's really wonderful.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I think that's really important because a lot of those metrics are ones that you wouldn't get out of the box with like the GA SDK, such as crash reporting and various like very mobile-centric.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what we did with Google Tag Manager, because we've tapped into that mechanism that Firebase has, is without any additional development work other than including the GTM SDK, you can actually start tapping into those events as triggers within Google Tag Manager right away. So that was available in May, and it's been possible to do this since then, but we haven't made it very easy for people to figure out exactly how to do that. So a few weeks ago, we launched a bunch of new UI updates that make this a lot more intuitive. And now when you're in a new mobile container inside of Google Tag Manager, you've got triggers available that correspond to all of those events that you automatically get for free. So when you're implementing those tags, you just assign those triggers, and then when you actually want to use the variables that are available with those, we've brought those into the UI directly as well. So we've just made it all easier to find and put it right out in front of people where they need it when they're ready to use it.
That's awesome. I think there's a lot of value to be gained by tapping into what's available through Firebase, and I love hearing that we're making that easier and easier as we go along.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So I just wanted to quickly highlight our takeaways. Really, it's just everything that we've covered today. So we talked about what is AMP, using GTM for AMP, best practices and tips. Martijn gave us a great overview of a case study for publishers at the Next Web. And finally, a few other things that we've got going on in Tag Manager for mobile apps. So I've got a bunch of resources for you. Before I go through these, I just want to remind everyone, go ahead and get your questions in, because as soon as I get through this slide, we're going to go ahead and start taking your questions. So fill them in the form or in the chat box, and we'll get to those in just a second. But I just wanted to quickly remind you of all the resources we do have available. So you'll see on your screen a list of various resources. We have the GTM Help Center. That's support.google.com/tagmanager. You'll see a blog post that we just recently put out maybe a week ago, Ben?
Yeah, 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago about all of these new releases for GTM for AMP. Mm-hmm. We also have Accelerated Mobile Pages documentation. That's ampproject.org to find out more about AMP in general, and I believe the roadmap is on there. ampproject.org/roadmap to learn what's going on with that roadmap. And finally, you can always get us on social at Google Analytics. I'm at Krista Seiden. And I know that Martijn is active on Twitter as well. Ben, I'm not sure if you tweet, but if you do, you can go ahead and tweet to Ben as well. Great. So with that, let's go ahead and move on over to our Q&A. So I've got a bunch of questions here coming in through the form. But again, get those questions in any way you want to send them. So, all right, this first question is from Yusuke. And they want to know, do we need to use data layers, and can we use data layers? Ben, I know you covered this, but maybe just you want to highlight that one more time?
Yeah, so in AMP containers, there is no official data layer in terms of what we're used to with Google Tag Manager on the web, where you actually call data layer.push and you actually add events or variables onto that. So it's not a kind of first class in your face sort of thing when we're talking about AMP. But we do have those variables. When you define variables inside of your analytics tag, or snippet rather, on the AMP page, those will be available to set up for use as variables in GTM.
Great. Jeff wants to know, can we push custom data layer variables to GTM via AMP? You might have just covered that a little bit, but if you have any other thoughts there.
I think that pretty much covers it.
Okay.
That's it.
I should listen more while you're answering. Manpreet wants to know about the installation and implementation of events and general best practices. So are there benefits of installing through GTM compared to hard-coded? Well, I think you highlighted several of those benefits.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes to the complexity that's required to really understand the whole kind of guts of how that giant JSON is configured, and then needing to go in and tweak that as opposed to just making a few small changes in the UI within GTM.
Great. Phil would like to know, why do custom AMP variables not work in lookup tables?
So this is a tricky one. This is a fun one. This gets into what is available on the client and what's available on the server. And AMP right now, the way that that it is, we don't have a lot of those client-side specific variables in the server where we're making a lot of those decisions about how and where to place those variables. So lookup, there is no client-side necessarily lookup tables that happen on the fly. That's just something that's not available in AMP today.
Gotcha.
So it's only what we have available on the server when you first make that request to the GTM container.
And is that just a limitation of how the pages are actually being served and kind of the fast?
Yeah, a lot of it really comes down to the fact that AMP doesn't have custom JavaScript, which really enables us to do a lot more working of the data and kind of doing things on the fly in the client.
Gotcha. Another question from Phil. Why are AMP events not selectable as triggers? I thought these were worded as events, but they are different.
These the triggers, let's see how to phrase this best. The triggers that are available in AMP are available in triggers. The events are really about the names that are used for that. So there may be some confusion in the naming there, and I'd need to take a closer look at that. But by and large, most of we tried to really get parity with what's available in AMP Analytics, doing everything custom, and what's available as built-in triggers.
Great. Jeff wants to know about scroll triggers. So maybe Martijn, you can go ahead and answer this one if you know. Are there any plans to? Oh, well, this is roadmap, so this is all done. Are there any
I wish I knew.
Are there any
Just tell me
plans to
that.
allow us to trigger a tag not on percentage, but upon reaching a certain content module or element, some kind of an anchor tag? I'd love that.
Oh.
Some kind of a view box or something like that.
So specific to scrolling, that is not something that's available today. But what is available is a viewability trigger. So instead of just a page view of, hey, this page loaded and we can fire off an event, you can get a little bit more creative with viewability in terms of picking a unique element on the page and only firing when that element is visible or it's a certain percentage visible. So that may achieve what you're after on that front.
Awesome. I'm going to have to play with that because, Jeff, I've had similar questions in the past.
Yeah.
Jeff also wants to know what's the difference between using page scroll trigger and page visibility trigger.
Sure. So page visibility trigger its primary function is as we would suggest that as soon as the page loads and everything's finished loading, it will fire off that hit. So whatever tag is configured to work on that, whether it's Google Analytics or AdWords conversion tracking, whatever that may be, we'll fire that as soon as the page loads. With the scroll triggers, what that does is it actually monitors how far down in the page you are. So if the page is, let's just 2,000 pixels tall, once somebody gets halfway through that and you have a scroll trigger set up for 50%, that trigger will then fire at that point in time. So it's really about tracking how far they've been able to get down the page for pages that have scrolling enabled.
Great. Dan would like to know, he says, I've been using fields to set with AMP, and I've noticed the variables are not being appended to the request strings even when I'm just hard coding them. Is this a bug?
This is an ongoing feature request that we have within Google Tag Manager for this. So today, as it is, they're in fields to set. It's not going to behave as we would all like it to, but it's something that we're definitely looking at and working on.
Feature request, not bug. Will we see, another question from Dan, will we see the scroll triggers brought into normal web containers? Yes, please.
Yes.
Well, I would love to see that as well. It's something that's on our radar for sure. It's something that it's very powerful, especially I think in Martijn's case as a publisher, but outside of publishers as well. It's something that is really useful to, it's another step in measuring user engagement.
Yeah, so currently we need to do a lot of work in the web version to get that to work and to get that to behave properly. So feature requests on my side as well.
Feature requests all around. All right, guys, I think that's all of the questions that we have that have come in. So I might just ask both of you as closing thoughts, what's your one tip or suggestion to people when getting started with GTM for AMP?
With GTM for AMP.
Or AMP or GTM.
Or just
whatever
AMP or GTM.
you'd like to suggest to the audience today.
Embrace it. I think on AMP as a whole is a really, really wonderful platform, and its goals, and which it's starting to already achieve, is about delivering really, really fantastic mobile experiences to people. So there are, for your web developers and such, there are a few constraints that they need to operate in, but it is worth the price. Having those really, really quick experiences and having, for instance, pages not jump around as I'm scrolling and reading through content, it's really, really, really nice to see. So I'd say embrace it, and a part of that, at Google Tag Manager, we're really trying to make sure that when you go to set up your measurement solutions, to make that portion as easy as possible. And
Martijn, from the publisher perspective?
I think I would like to add to that, start now. The roadmap of AMP is going so fast, and the GTM team is doing such a great job. That the longer you wait, the more work it's going to be to either switch from AMP Analytics to GTM, or the worse it's going to be that you're going to miss out on all the opportunities that AMP could bring you. Because for us, it really was a big deal to go with AMP in the end, and luckily for us, we made the right bet to go with AMP instead of going first with other social platforms.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And I'll just add on to the roadmap bit. The AMP team is constantly adding a bunch of new stuff all the time. They are really sprinting. So, what may be perceived as missing or unavoidable things, they've had continual release after continual release of adding new features and functionality. So they've really stayed on top of it.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us today. I think this was really beneficial for our users, especially bringing in that publisher viewpoint of how you would actually put this into practice. Yeah. So thank you, Martijn, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you guys for tuning in. See you next week.